here we have the life cycle laid out. So on the left here with the pink tree is where winter is and spring is going to start, moving through summer, and then the end is fall.
I want to welcome everybody tonight to our Zoom program supporting Missouri's bumblebees. My name is Ann Gerard. I'm a librarian here at the Columbia Public Library. I'm very excited to do this program tonight. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping things. As you may already be aware of our library's events website, which lists everything that's upcoming. And if not, we will have a link to it in the chat this evening, as well as links to our Facebook and Instagram accounts for the library where you can find out information on our upcoming programs. Tonight's program is in Zoom and will be recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube page along with a lot of other recorded programs here at the library. As you are listening to the program, if questions come up, you should be able to enter a chat question to us, which all you have to do is hover your mouse over the chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a tablet, it might not pop up until you tap the screen. And then you can go ahead and type in your question and we will answer those throughout the program or at the end, depending on how time goes. But now it's time to begin the program. And so I'd like to welcome and introduce our presenter, Katie Lamke. Katie is a conservation biologist, and tonight we'll be discussing the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas, a community science effort to track and conserve our state's native bumblebees. She will explain the importance of the bumblebees, their conservation status, and the things that we can do to support these vital pollinators. So let's just sit back and enjoy and learn a little something. Welcome, Katie.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I'm glad to be here tonight. Small group means there's tons of room for any kinds of questions that you have, spanning all kinds of bee subjects, more than just the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas. So feel free to drop something in the Q&A or the chat if you have a question that pops up, and we'll answer them as we go along. So I'm a conservation biologist for the Xerces Society. Let me get the slideshow going here. There we go. If you haven't heard of the Xerces Society, we are a nonprofit science-based organization that works to support invertebrates as well as the habitat that they need to survive. And we're named after the first butterfly known to go extinct from human causes, which was the Xerces blue butterfly. And it's not the one pictured here on the screen, but it is a relative of this one. It used to live out in the San Francisco Bay Area, but as a result of habitat loss and destruction, the butterfly was wiped out. So our founder, Robert Michael Pyle, decided to name the organization after that butterfly back in 1971. And most of our work is done through conservation, advocacy, research, and education. So we have lots of folks on the ground helping to restore areas to support pollinators, whether that be on rangelands or farmlands, agricultural areas, but also in some urban areas now. Working with legislatures to get some more policies passed to support pollinators. We participate in research and supporting universities, and also projects like this with education and just spreading the word about bees and other pollinators and why we need them on the earth. And we do all of this because invertebrates are so valuable, right? They help with decomposition, biocontrol. They're the base of many types of food chains, both aquatic and terrestrial. And particularly to today's topic, they relate to pollination. So only about 2% of insects are considered pests, and the rest of them have a vital role in supporting the way that we live our life. And when we talk about pollinators specifically, we consider them to be keystone species for a few reasons. And one of those is that they supply pollination, right? They're helping our plants reproduce. More than 85% of flowering plants require some sort of insect, which is usually a bee, to reproduce. And when plants reproduce, that's when we see things like seeds and nuts and berries. But through this, they're also giving us the vital nutrition that we need, right? Through vitamins and minerals. They're also contributing to the economy, millions of dollars each year. And, like I said earlier, they're the base of the food chain. So our main groups of pollinators, when we think more widely, can include things like birds and bats, but insect-wise, it includes butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and bees. But we focus on bees when we think about pollination because they are the most effective pollinator, and that's for 3 different reasons. One of them is that bees are the only insects to collect and consume nectar and pollen as both a larvae and an adult. So flowers are their only source of food. Many of our other insects can feed on salty substances, or they might be predators and consume some type of meat, but bees are solely relying on flowers for their entire life cycle. And because of that, bees have adapted a suite of characteristics that allow them to collect and transport mass amounts of pollen as they're flying to and from their nest. So here we have a bumblebee, and if you look at their hind leg right there, the structure is called a corbicula, or a pollen basket. It's essentially a grooved out area on their leg that's surrounded by really long hairs. So the bees will collect pollen and sort of groom it back onto their hind legs. So as they fly around, they'll have these huge yellow baskets on their legs that helps keep them balanced, right? Rather than just flying around with pollen all over their body, they're intentionally putting it somewhere on their body. So here we have a bee with their pollen basket completely full. Oops, too fast there. So the last thing that we're looking at here is flower constancy. So bees, when they leave the nest and they're going on a foraging trip to go collect some nectar and pollen and bring it back to their nest, they are going to exhibit this behavior where they're going to visit the same type of flower on that foraging trip. So while there might be roses and tulips and mints all in the same field, they're going to choose to go from mint flower to mint flower to mint flower. And what that does is it ensures the proper pollen is getting to the proper plant, right? They all need their own pollens to reproduce. So the bees and the plants have this very tight mutual relationship where they're supporting one another. But when most of us think of a bee, we think of a honeybee, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Honeybees are the gateway for a lot of folks into the world of pollinators. And that's because they're an object of familiarity for us, right? They're in a lot of different people's cultures. They're in a lot of stories and folklore. They are an agricultural commodity for us to maintain all the large crops that we have. They're a huge tool for educators. But honeybees are a non-native species that are considered livestock. So these animals are more closely related to, cows and chickens, as in they're managed by humans rather than the wild bees. So when we think of wild bees and supporting our wild pollinators, we don't want this object to come to our head. We want to look at some of our other wild bees. And worldwide, there's about 20,000 different species of wild bees. In North America, there's 5,200, and in just the United States and Canada, there's about 3,600. And these are only the species that we know about. In the world of insects, there are many, many, many creatures yet to be discovered. And just from this page alone, you can see that there is a lot of diversity in size and color and structure and tongue length even. So a few examples here of size. This is a bee up next to a wasp. I'm sorry, it looks like a wasp, but this is a bee up next to a dime. So if you didn't, recognize that this was a bee, you might not even see it flying by. So there's a great size diversity here. They also come in many different colors. So this is a small carpenter bee. This kind of a bee would be a stem nester. So it would make its home in the stem of a rose bush, or maybe some big blue stem, some sort of plant that's got a pithy center to it. Here's a beautiful picture of a sweat bee. Many people are familiar with these bees during the summertime. They might come and land on your skin, and what they're doing is literally licking up your sweat. It acts as a form of electrolyte for them. It's kind of like a source of Gatorade. So if you kind of just watch them, they'll put their little tongue out on you and fly off when they've had enough. And all the little pink dots that you're seeing here on this bee are pollen grains that it's collected, and you can see that it started to groom them onto the back leg. And then lastly, here's a beautiful picture of a large, fuzzy, chunky bumblebee. So our bumblebees are adapted for these cooler climates, so they tend to be a little bit larger than some of our other bees and a lot more hairier, if you want to use that term. And let's stop right there and see if there's any questions so far. Nope, doesn't look like it. Okay, so now we're going to go just into bumblebees. And worldwide for bumblebees, there's about 250 different species. In North America alone, there's about 47. And on the map here, where you see areas of red, those are where bumblebees are the most diverse. So if you go out west and up into higher elevations, so here we're kind of following the mountain ranges where the red is, that's where you're going to find the most species of bumblebees because they're fit for those cooler climates. So as you're on a mountain and you go up in elevation, you're going to get more and more species. In Missouri, relatively flat, there's only about 10 species, which if you're trying to learn bumblebees is really nice because you don't have 30 different species that you have to learn. You only have 10. Oops. PowerPoint is frozen, so please enjoy this map for another second. There we go. Okay, so the bumblebee colony. So bumblebees are a social organism, but slightly different from honeybees. So when we think of honeybees, we think of the queen bee and the worker bees. There's also a caste of male bees, and they all live in a hive and are supported by humans throughout the entire year. Bumblebees are kind of similar to that in that they have a queen and a worker and male bees, but their colony is only active on the landscape for the summer months and sometimes into fall. After that, it's just the queen who's going to be essentially hibernating. So if you can keep that in your mind, this is the way that the bumblebee works. So we have the queens, the workers, and the males that will be out at slightly different times. But during the summertime, they will all be on the landscape, which is why we see a lot more bumblebees during the summertime. The colonies, depending on the species and the habitat quality, can be anywhere from 25 to 1,000 different individuals during its peak. And they'll often nest in sort of these messy areas. So abandoned rodent burrows are very popular choices for bees. Sometimes in the thickets of bunch grasses, unmowed areas, some old rock walls or brush piles. Some of them are a little bit more advantageous and will use bird boxes, or they'll nest in some exposed insulation on a barn. But here we have the life cycle laid out. So on the left here with the pink tree is where winter is and spring is going to start, moving through summer, and then the end is fall. So if we start on the left-hand side, what we're looking at here is the queen emerging from hibernation. So the queen has been underground for about 6 months, and she's dug herself a little hole, and she's been hibernating there all by herself. So it's a very vulnerable stage for her in the life cycle because there's no protection of the colony. It's just her on her own. out in the vast world. So when she emerges in spring, depending on species, again, that could be late March, it could be late May, could be early June. They kind of stagger when they come out. The queen is going to spend some time flying around, probably a couple weeks, looking for a good nest location. She's also going to be visiting those early blooming flowers to collect some carbohydrates and get some energy so that she can do the work that she needs to do. And she's going to start making little wax pots and filling them with pollen and nectar, and eventually getting to the stage of laying eggs. So if you look in the bottom, if I can get a pointer out here. In the bottom right here, this is the queen with her little eggs that she's laying. So each of these little things that look like grains of rice, that's about the size of a bumblebee egg. She's also got some wax pots over here that's filled with a mixture of honey and nectar to feed both herself, but also to begin feeding the larvae as they develop. So again, this is still a vulnerable time for the queen because she's the only one in the nest. About 4 to 6 weeks later, those young eggs will have hatched and turned into larvae, and then the larvae will grow and eventually emerge as adult worker bees. And so during the summertime, the queen is just going to remain in the colony, and she's going to keep laying eggs. So right here, we can see the queen is just laying eggs and eggs and eggs, and she's going to have her worker bees that are tending to these eggs and making sure the larvae are fed. Other worker bees are going to have different roles. They're going to be out on the landscape foraging for food. Some of them are going to be defense related, right? So they're going to make sure the nest is protected. They're going to make sure it's temperature regulated. They're going to grow the nest if they need to do that. They'll repair the nest. So there's lots of different roles within the colony during the summer. Towards the end of the summer is when we start to see male bees and new queens being produced. And so let's skip along here. So here we have a new queen that was produced by this colony and a male bee. And so these two individuals, not individuals, the case, I should say, the new queens and worker bees leave the nest, and they're going to go search for members of other colonies to mate with, right? They want to switch up their genetics. So they're going to mate with people, not with people, with other bees from other colonies. And after that happens, the male bees will die off. So they don't really have roles in the colony, right? They're not really present during the main part of the colony. They're not active during the summertime because they're produced in late summer. Then they're going to go and mate and die off. So their main role is to diversify the gene pool. And then the rest of the colony, so this colony that was right here, is also going to begin dying off. The old queen is going to die. The worker bees are going to die. You can see them face up here. And then the new queen, who has been mated, is going to spend her last couple of weeks foraging on any remaining blooms, getting those carbs stored up so that she can then find a place to safely overwinter for the next 6 months. So that's kind of the life cycle of the bumblebee. Of course, it can vary a little bit by species and when they're active on the landscape. But in general, this is how it goes. So if we keep that in mind, that helps us to figure out how we can support bumblebees throughout the year. It's also fun to know about cuckoo bumblebees. So if you know about birds, there are birds that will essentially parasitize a nest, right? And so cuckoo bumblebees do the same thing. So down at the bottom here, this picture is of a cuckoo bumblebee. It looks very similar to a bumblebee, but it's got some differences to it. You can see that it's less hairy than the other ones. It also has a much thicker exoskeleton, or the skin of the bumblebee is a lot tougher, and it has a stronger stinger. And it needs all of those things because what this bee is going to do is invade the nest of the bumblebee at a very precise time of the year and try and take over that nest. So this cuckoo bee wants to invade when there are enough workers that they'll be able to continue foraging and take care of the cuckoo eggs, but not so many workers that they will be able to kill her when she attacks. So these cuckoo bees, it's kind of like an evolved life cycle. They're not going to make their own nest. They're not going to forage for their own food. They're simply going to attach onto somebody else's nest and somebody else's workers and lay their own eggs. And bumblebees, as a group, have some differences compared to some of our other pollinators that makes them a little bit special. One of them is their physiology. So I mentioned earlier that they are fit for these cooler climates, and as such, they can fly in these cooler climates. So earlier in the morning, late at night, when the temperature is not as warm as midday, bumblebees will still be active. Whereas some of our other wild bees that are smaller don't have the ability to generate the heat that bumblebees do. So they're not going to be able to be out pollinating flowers in those early mornings or the late evenings. Bumblebees are also intelligent and they can learn to access resources. So here you can see one trying to pry into a bottle gentian. Bumblebees are quite innovative too. So they can use their strength like you're seeing with the bottle gentian. They can also sit down on lips of flowers. If you think about a pea plant or wild indigo, they have the little lips to them. And so when bumblebees pollinate these flowers and are seeking the nectar or the pollen, they'll have to use their weight to pry that flower down in order to access it. So smaller bees wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. And bumblebees are also long-tongued creatures. And when I talk about tongue length, it might go over some of your heads, but this is a way that we divide up our wild bees. There are short-tongued bees and there are long-tongued bees. Bumblebees as a whole fall into the long-tongued bees. So you can see, let me get out the pointer here again. This right here is a bumblebee tongue that is semi-retracted. So when they're flying around, they'll keep their tongue kind of tucked up under their chin. But as they get near a flower, it's going to come out and extend all the way in here. So this bee also has its tongue extended out. This one probably does too. And that allows them to access resources from a wider variety of flowers, because the short-tongued bees would not be able to access that. Bumblebees can also buzz pollinate, which is essentially like sonication. You've heard of people going around pollinating their tomato plants or pepper plants with a tuning fork. They're essentially doing the work of a bumblebee. So what the bumblebee does for buzz pollination is it essentially grabs on to the base of the anthers. So right here, right in here, and it's going to generate a vibration using its muscles. And that dislodges the pollen grains and allows the pollen grains to fall out of the flowers. And 8% of flowers can benefit from this, meaning they have pollen grains that are held really tightly within their anthers. And they need that sonication in order for the pollen to fall out and reproduce. So here we have a GIF. And what you're seeing here, if you look closely, is this is a slow motion clip of a bumblebee generating enough vibration that pollen grains are kind of falling out of the anthers or the tips of the yellow part right here. And so that pollen is falling all over the bee's belly and she will groom it onto her back legs again. And so while we do know a lot about bumblebees, relative to other creatures on the planet like polar bears or a lot of our birds, we know way less about bees than we do those animals. And so there's a lot we don't know about nesting biology or hibernation, where do the queens go? Because if you think about finding a tiny bumblebee somewhere in the ground, it's very hard to do. And so there are just things about their life cycle that we don't yet understand or have found a good way to study it. Same thing goes with dispersal. So tracking those queens when they emerge from the ground. How far are they going? How are they mating with a male? Like, where did that male come from? How far did he travel? How far will those genes mix up? And a lot of the threats and stressors too, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. It's hard to pick apart different stresses and how they're interacting with the bee. And so one of the things that we need to do is build up these baseline data sets that will help us answer and understand our uncertainties. So on the screen here is Dr. Robin Thorpe, and he kind of started this process of needing to build up baseline data sets. He ran his research out in California, and in the late 90s and early 2000s, he realized that some of his most common species were becoming rare. And so he started gathering data in a way that we would be able to track population trends. And prior to this, most of the data gathered in the field of pollination biology or pollination ecology was usually focused on the plant. So if somebody would be interested in a plant and wanted to know who pollinated it. And so we don't have a lot of data just focused on the bees. So Robin's idea was to go around and collect these baseline data sets and figure out how many of these species exist and what kinds of plants they're foraging on and how their ranges are changing over time. And as he started talking with his colleagues, it came out that other people were experiencing the same thing, and that their most common bees that were usually very easy to find across the ranges were becoming rare. So the western bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, the yellow-banded bumblebee, and the rusty patch bumblebee are 4 very closely related species that were once very common and have all been petitioned, and 2 of them have been granted federally endangered status. So the Franklin's bumblebee and the rusty patch bumblebee are federally endangered species. The western bumblebee the ruling is due out for that this year or next year on whether or not that bee will join the list. And the yellow-banded bumblebee was actually declined its listing. They didn't think there was enough evidence that this bee was in need of decline. So most of these bees that we're seeing are doing okay, but there are a lot that are declining. And so a group across the world came together, and they were bee biologists and bumblebee experts from all over, and they decided to run assessments on the species in their area to see how they're doing. And so everywhere that you see is colored on this map here is where there are native bumblebees. And so in North America, the assessments that came out showed that 1/4 of the bee species here, of the bumblebees anyways, are in a threatened or a near threatened category. 5 of them in the gray part of the pie are data deficient, meaning that we just don't have enough information on them to make a call on how their population is doing. But then most of them seem to be doing okay. They're either increasing in population or they're somewhat stable. And so when we look at the threatened or near threatened bees a little closer, these are the species in the central United States here. And 5 of those that are listed in bold are or were found in Missouri at some point. So the rusty patch bumblebee historically occurred in Missouri, and you can see it's listed as critically endangered. And along the bottom there, you can see that after critically endangered comes extinct in the wild and then extinct. So some of these bees are already pretty far along. But then there's others like the American bumblebee listed as vulnerable, which that species is found in Missouri quite a bit, which doesn't mean that it doesn't need our help. It just means it's more at a point where we can still make an impact on the species and keep it from getting so far along. So some of the threats when we think about bee decline, as I said earlier, it's hard to pick them apart. And this paper designs it really nicely and describing it as death by 1,000 cuts, right? So bumblebees and many of our other insects are getting hit with habitat loss and destruction and climate change and insecticides and pesticides and fungicides. And this happens all in an agricultural environment and also in the urban environments, right? It's not just one, it's kind of all of us making choices along the way. And then we also have to think about the interaction of these threats, because those also play a role, right? So if you think about when you're sick and you have to go to work, you're not as motivated to do your job. It's not as easy to do your job. And it's the same for the pollinators, right? When they're hit with even a sublethal effect of a pesticide from a field, right? They're out gathering their pollen, they picked up some residue, and now they're not feeling as good. It's going to be harder for them to continue doing their job. It also has reproductive effects. So bumblebees that have been exposed to these pesticides and fungicides and herbicides, it's going to show in their genetics, and it's going to show in their future populations. So it sort of just works out to this plight of the bumblebee, right? It's not one thing, it's sort of bumblebees trying to make it through a wave of obstacles. So going back to this here and how we can support bumblebees, there are things that we can do to sort of mitigate some of the obstacles for them, or at least provide them with some little patches of habitat here and there. And bumblebee habitat really comes down to 4 main components. One of them is obviously food resources. We think about pollinator habitat, flowers come to mind for a lot of people, right? Because bees need flowers. That's their main food source. Shelter is also an important thing. They need somewhere to nest. They need somewhere to overwinter. As we just learned, the queens are going to be in the ground. And they need these patches to be connected. And then hopefully, or ideally, I should say, these areas will be pesticide free. It's not possible in all cases, but in a lot of options, or a lot of, like home areas, it's very possible to make an area pesticide free. So talking about food resources, it's nice to have diversity for them, because a diverse diet is obviously better for a healthy bee, just like us, right? If we eat saltine crackers all the time, it's not going to be very healthy for us. So having a diversity of flowers and shrubs from spring through summer and late fall is going to be the best option. And if you can, try and use native plants, because these are already adapted to the areas that we live in. Most of them can handle drought a lot better than non-natives or a lot of the ornamentals that you might buy. And unfortunately, not all plants are equal. So a lot of these modern cultivars, or the double petal flowers that you can buy in the store, were made to please us, right? Not the bees. And many of them don't offer nectar or pollen. So it's kind of like a useless flower in the bee's mind. So if you can, do some research before you go buy your native plants and look up which ones the bees like. There are many, many resources from Xerces. We have a list of native plants. Missouri Prairie Foundation has a list of plants. Missouri Department of Conservation, I believe, also has a list of plants. So check out some resources that already exist for your area and try and find a good local nursery that will actually have plants that are not doused in pesticides. Something like this, would be my dream garden, the Yarden, just full of diversity here. We've got nesting resources, we've got overwintering resources, we've got food throughout the seasons, but it doesn't have to be this way, right? You can have a small little box or a border, or introduce some more hardscapes and some lines for our brain to recognize where edges are. Pollinator habitat doesn't have to be messy as many of us might think it might be. But certainly if you're up to this level, definitely send pictures. I love seeing when people just totally go habitat in their yard. So nesting habitat for bees, for bumblebees is usually a messy area is how we can think of it. They like the rodent holes, overgrown areas. If you have a brush pile or a rock pile that you're not going to touch from, say, May to September, October, that would be a really good place for a bumblebee to nest. But if you plan on moving it during the summer, you're going to disturb the bees. So just think about these things if they're on your landscape. Unmown structures, man-made structures. I've seen a lot of photos come in of bees nesting under hay bales or under an overturned, I'm blanking on the name for it, wheelbarrow, or like a horse saddle was one that somebody sent in. Things that don't get touched often but have some pre-existing insulation is a really good place for a bumblebee. Providing overwintering sites. So bumblebees will tend to nest a few centimeters under the ground in winter. A lot of our other bees will nest inside of stems or twigs. So if you have the ability to leave your dead vegetation up through the winter and cut it back in early spring, that's going to be providing a lot of homes for not only our bees, but also wasps and butterflies and moths whose larvae might be overwintering on the ground there as well. So thinking of our spaces as a part of the puzzle, right? We can't provide everything for the bee, but we can provide a piece for it. We can start to connect our little pieces of habitat. And this definitely supports the bees in an urban environment. And the last thing that we can do is community science. So I think we're going to stop here for a second and see if there's any questions. Bumblebees buzzing on partridge peas. Yeah, Maggie, that was probably buzz pollination. If you heard them making an audible buzz, it's a little bit different than they would make if they were just gathering pollen there. Yeah, okay. All right, so the Missouri Bumble Bee Atlas. I wish I could see all your faces here so I could ask how many of you know about this project or not. It started in 2020, and it's a collaboration between the Missouri Department of Conservation, Mizzou, Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, and Xerces. And it's a statewide project where people get involved to help us track and conserve Missouri's bumblebees. And now that you know there are so many other bumblebees in the world, or maybe you already knew that, you might wonder why we're only looking for bumblebees if there are so many other species in the state. There's a few reasons for that. One of them is that they are charismatic. They're a very recognizable bee. So a lot of people know about honeybees, but a lot of people also know about bumblebees. And that might be as far as a beginner's knowledge goes. They're also a generalist species, meaning that they're going to be found in a lot of different types of habitat. So some of our wild bees are wetland specialists, right? You'll only find them in a particular habitat, but bumblebees are going to be found in a lot of different places, right? We'll find them in the forest, we'll find them in the grassland, we'll find them at the wetland, we'll find them in alpine meadows. They're all over the place. And they also have a long active season. So thinking about the life cycle, the queen can emerge anytime between late March through early June, and they'll be active on the landscape until October and November, depending on how the weather turns out that year. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to find these species. Some other wild bees might only be active for 4 to 6 weeks. That's how long it takes them to do their life cycle. So looking for that species that might only be found in a wetland. It's a lot harder to do than a species that's in a wide variety of habitats and found for quite a good portion of the year. And we also know that bumblebees are imperiled. So relative to other bee species, we know a lot about bumblebees, which sounds contradictory to what I said earlier. Bees as a whole, we have a lot to learn, but we know the most probably about bumblebees if we're talking about wild bees. And so we have the most data to be able to say that yes, some of these species are showing decline and need us to step in. So what the Atlas is doing is building those baseline data sets that we talked about. So just collecting simple information on what species are in Missouri, what numbers we're seeing them in, what flowers they're utilizing in different parts of the state and throughout different times of the year. And this helps us to assess how the populations are doing in the state and figure out how those distributions are changing or shifting. You know, are we seeing species shift northwards with climate change, or are species that are typically found in the east beginning to move west? You know, there's a lot of different factors that might cause a bumblebee to shift, and having data on them helps us to understand that. We also do brief habitat surveys. So asking people what kind of habitat they're in. Are they in a grassland? Are they in an agricultural area? Are they in a developed area? And we look for nesting resources and management practices that are occurring in the area to sort of parse out what habitats bumblebees are being found in and which habitats they're not being found in, so that we can figure out what we can do in Missouri to improve bumblebee populations in the state. So the way the project is set up is that the state is divided into 75 grid cells, and as volunteers sign up, they go through training, and then you adopt a grid cell that you want to survey. So this could be a grid cell where you already live. It could be maybe there's a campground that you go to every summer. It could be in that grid cell. Maybe you're driving through the state somewhere and you want to do a survey in the north end. Grid cell adoption is up to the participant. Then you do your surveys, you submit your data, and all of the results come in, and we start to analyze those and put them to work. And the great thing about it is Missouri is not the only state participating in this. So Pacific Northwest was the first atlas that launched in 2018. Then Nebraska came on in 2019. Then Missouri was the third project, and now we're up to 15 states. So it's pretty exciting. It continues to grow. We're getting a lot of good data that, you know, my small team of people would not be able to gather on our own. So the way it works, if you're interested in joining, we have all of our training materials online in a video format. We also have them in a handbook format if reading is more your thing. And we have the materials on there. So the Bumblebee identification guide, the data sheets, a supplies list. And we also hold live trainings. Sometimes our workshops are in person. A lot of times the workshops will be a virtual format, but then we hold field trainings throughout the summer. Last year in Missouri, we had 4 field trainings. There was one in Kansas City, Columbia, Springfield, St. Louis. You know, we try to hit the bigger areas where people are going to be. And we'll teach you how to swing nets and how to handle bumblebees, talk about identification, photography. And the big part about this project is it's catch and release. So there are no bumblebees harmed in any of this. And the way we get around that is by chilling the bees that we catch and putting them in these little tubes. And you set those tubes on ice, and it cools the bumblebee down enough to where you can get a really nice photograph. So after you're all trained up, you go out to your grid cell and conduct, we ask for at least 2 surveys anytime between June and September. There's data sheets for you to fill out that are pretty simple. And then yeah, so these are examples of some of the pictures here that people are trying to take. And photography is a really big part of the trainings here because since we're not collecting the bees, it's usually myself or another project coordinator who is sitting on the back end identifying all these bees by photos. And in order to do that, we need specific angles to make sure that we're seeing the features that we need to identify. And sometimes we're looking at the base of the antennae and seeing if there's a tiny patch of hairs, or we're looking at the color of the hairs on the hind tibia, or we're looking at the cheek length, like these really intricate details that we're not asking you to learn. Certainly some people do because of their own interest. We're just going to teach you what photo angles that we need in order to make the identifications with confidence. And so all of those photographs and data sheets get submitted to Bumble Bee Watch, which if you've used eBird before or iNaturalist, it's similar to that project. But this website just collects Bumble Bee observations from North America and Canada. And in the past almost 10 years, these Atlas programs that have been started have substantially grown the amount of records that we have. Right, so you can see down at the bottom in 2018, when the first Atlas project was launched, we had significant records come in. And each year after that, as another project joined in, we see more and more records. And then all of that data gets turned into tools for conservation. So we have identification guides that have been produced. We have habitat management guidance for land stewards that have been produced. We have really detailed species accounts for people that are dealing with, contract builds, and they need to make sure that there's none of these at-risk species in their area, or maybe they want to supply habitat for an alpine species. They can find out which bumblebees are going to be in their area of interest. And something that is really fun about this project is that there are a lot of people involved in it, and people enjoy participating in this project. I think once you hold a bumblebee in your hand, it's not something that you'd ever think you would do, but maybe I'm biased here, but it's pretty enjoyable. It's a different experience. It's exciting to get out into some of these natural areas that you might know and love and look for something that's slightly different than you have before. So some of the results that we found from the past 3 summers, there's almost 200 people participating. We've almost observed 4,000 bumblebees. We're about 70 shy this year. 8 different species have been detected, and almost 500 habitat surveys have been run. And just looking at this map here, we're seeing the blue dots, those are observations, and the squares are where people have run a survey. So pretty good statewide coverage. Here's a bar graph of all the states that I oversee, and you can see that Missouri there is right on top. So they won in the number of surveys this year and the number of people that submitted to Bumble Bee Watch. And some of this could come down to that Missouri has the most people in their state out of all of these, but we don't need to mention those details. We'll just say that Missouri is doing the best. And same with this one. Missouri brought in 1,500 observations of bumblebees just this summer, which is really, really amazing. When we look at some of the species that have been found, this is separated out by the 8 species as well as year. So the top dark bar is observations from 2022, then 2021, then 2020. So the most frequently observed was the common eastern bumblebee, then the brown belted. Both of those are very common, very abundant throughout their ranges. But if we look down at the southern plains bumblebee down here, that one and the one right below it, the half black bumblebee, those 2 are species of concern in Missouri. So we know that those ones are declining. They're on the state's list. They're keeping a watch on those. And looking closer at the southern plains here, there were 22 observations of it last year. And this map shows from 10 years ago about where the southern plains existed. The orange is its range. The red part with the stripes is where it is expected to no longer exist. And so Missouri is kind of near one of those ranges, but the western part of the state, is pretty much in the heart of this bee's range. So we would hope to continue to see that bee there, because when bumblebees start to decline, it's usually from the outermost edges first. And what we see is that it is pretty well dispersed, but there's an odd gap there, right? So here in the map, we're looking at all the little squares. Those are where people intentionally went to go look for bees. And the blue dots are where the Southern Plains bumblebee showed up on the map. And when we bring in habitat, you can see here that the brown part, that's the Ozark Highlands. So a more forested, rocky, bluff part of the state. And we know that the Southern Plains bumblebee is typically a grassland species. So it makes sense that while we did a lot of surveys in that area, we're not finding this species. Conversely, somebody like the half-black bumblebee, another species of concern, is a species that is associated with forests. And so more than half of the observations of this bee, while there are not many, are in that forested region of the state. And then we have bees like the common eastern bumblebee that is definitely not in decline, is, if anything, is probably increasing, and it's everywhere, right? It's in all different habitats of the state. It's found on a lot of surveys. So looking at these things together is helpful information to figure out what the state can be doing. We can also look at plant data. So here we have a bar graph. The blue bars are number of visits to a plant by a bumblebee, and the orange dots are the number of species of bumblebee that visited that plant. So the first one there, Monarda, is bee balm. So it had a lot of visits of bumblebees, but 6 species. Whereas Xerces, the third one over, right here, didn't have as many visits, but had more species. And you can see that we had a lot of purple plants, a lot of yellow plants, some white ones. And so learning about which plants are drawing the bumblebees in, how many species they're providing food for, if it's a matter of abundance or if it's a matter of quality, what color has to say about it. All of these little pieces help us design better restorations for bumblebees. So that's just a little teaser on the Atlas. If you want to join, you could go to mobumblebeeatlas.org, and we'll have our trainings in May next year. So I just want to finish off here by saying thank you. Xerces definitely does not do our work alone. We have tons and tons of partners that support us along the way. We are a donor-funded organization, so if you like the work that we're doing and you want to join one of the 13,000 members in supporting us, you can go to xerces.org/donate. And with that, I'll leave up the website and our social media handle if you want to follow along and learn when events are. And that's it. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was really pretty interesting. I honestly had no idea how many different types of bees are on our library catalog. Our associate Maggie, who has participated in this program herself, put together a great list of books about bumblebees and they contain lots of information on how we can help them and bring them into our area and keep them going. So be sure to check our catalog for that list. It's the #1 list at the moment. So yeah, I want to thank you again, Katie, for this great presentation. And just remind everybody this has been recorded, so it will be posted on our YouTube page within the next week or so. So if you need any of this information again, you'll be able to find it there. And thank you again. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.